In 1865, as the echoes of the American Civil War faded, the United States stood at a historic crossroads. Slavery had been abolished, the Confederacy defeated, and nearly 4 million formerly enslaved people stepped into freedom for the first time. For many, this moment promised a new nation built on equality and citizenship. But for others, it triggered fear, resentment, and a desperate desire to reclaim a lost social order. Out of this turbulent aftermath emerged a group that would leave a dark and lasting mark on American history. What began as a small, secretive social fraternity formed by former Confederate veterans soon transformed into something far more dangerous. Under the cover of tradition, symbolism, and secrecy, the Ku Klux Klan evolved into an organization dedicated to enforcing racial hierarchy and resisting social change. Its influence would stretch far beyond the Reconstruction era, resurfacing again and again whenever progress threatened established power. This is not just a story about one organization. It is a story about how fear can be organized, how myths can be weaponized, and how ordinary people can be drawn into movements that shape nations for generations. The Klan's history reveals how racism adapts to new times, disguises itself in respectability, and embeds itself into politics, culture, and everyday life. In this documentary, we will trace the Klan's origins, its rise and fall, and the conditions that allowed it to repeatedly return. More importantly, we will examine why understanding this history still matters today, in a world where old ideas often return in new forms. If you find value in deep, honest explorations of history like this one, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Your support helps keep these important stories alive. Now, let's begin. As the nation entered the era known as Reconstruction, the promises of freedom and citizenship faced their first real test. Laws were passed to grant formerly enslaved people the right to vote, to hold office, and to participate in public life. Federal troops were stationed across the southern states to enforce these changes, and for a brief moment, it seemed possible that the country might truly rebuild itself on new foundations. Black communities organized schools, churches, and political networks, while newly elected representatives began to reshape local governments. To many observers, this period represented a fragile but genuine attempt at democracy. Yet beneath the surface, resistance was already taking shape. The Ku Klux Klan, no longer a harmless fraternity of bored veterans, began to operate as an underground force determined to reverse these changes. Moving at night and hiding behind secrecy and symbols, its members sought to control behavior through fear rather than law. Their goal was not chaos for its own sake, but order on their own terms, a society where political power, economic opportunity, decent, and social authority remained firmly in white hands. Violence became a language, carefully chosen and deliberately displayed. Acts of intimidation were often directed at those who dared to cross invisible boundaries, especially African Americans who attempted to vote, organize politically, or hold public office. Teachers, ministers, and community leaders were singled out because they represented possibility and progress. By making examples of such individuals, the Klan sent a clear message to entire communities about the cost of participation. Fear traveled faster than any written law, spreading from one town to the next through rumor, silence, and shared understanding. This campaign was not random. It followed the rhythms of elections and legislative reforms, intensifying whenever political power seemed to shift. Polling places were watched, homes were threatened, and livelihoods were destroyed, all with the intention of discouraging civic engagement. White allies who supported Reconstruction were also targeted, accused of betrayal, and punished for stepping outside the racial order. In this way, the Klan functioned as an unofficial enforcement arm, shaping outcomes without ever appearing on a ballot. What made this period especially devastating was how effective these tactics proved to be. Over time, participation declined, not because the desire for equality disappeared, but because survival took priority. Families learned which topics could be discussed openly and which could not. Communities adapted, finding ways to endure while carrying the weight of constant pressure. Meanwhile, Local authorities often looked the other way, and in some cases quietly benefited from the results. Justice became uneven, applied selectively. Felicity, reinforcing the very system Reconstruction was meant to dismantle. By the early 1870s, federal intervention weakened the Klan's original structure, but the damage had already been done. The idea that progress could be rolled back through intimidation had taken root. When political control gradually returned to white Southern elites, they no longer needed secret groups to enforce dominance. Laws and institutions could do the work more quietly. Segregation replaced open terror, and exclusion became routine rather than dramatic, embedding inequality into everyday life. This chapter of the story reveals a central truth. Reconstruction failed not because its ideals were flawed, but because they were met with organized resistance willing to exploit fear and silence. The Ku Klux Klan was both a product of this moment and a catalyst that shaped what followed. Its actions during these years did more than disrupt elections. They reshaped the boundaries of American democracy, leaving consequences that would echo long after the hoods disappeared from view. As fear tightened its grip during Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan began to change in character. What had once been loosely connected groups acting under shared symbols and intentions gradually evolved into something more coordinated and far more dangerous. This transformation did not happen by accident. It required leadership, legitimacy in the eyes of its followers, and a figure whose reputation alone could command obedience. In this climate, the Klan rallied around men whose pasts were rooted in war, hierarchy, and absolute authority. None more influential than Nathan Bedford Forrest. For many white Southerners still struggling to accept defeat, Forrest represented defiance and strength, his wartime reputation, his confidence, and his willingness to embrace violence as a political tool gave the Klan a sense of purpose it had previously lacked. Under such leadership, the organization shifted from sporadic intimidation to deliberate strategy. Secrecy became discipline, and chaos became coordination. Local groups no longer acted entirely on impulse, but began to follow a shared understanding of who needed to be silenced and why. The focus of this new phase was clear. Black political leaders, elected officials, educators, and organizers became primary targets because they embodied the success of Reconstruction. They were living proof that citizenship was no longer theoretical but real. Their visibility made them symbols, and symbols, the Klan believed, could not be allowed to stand. At the same time, white Republicans who supported federal reforms were labeled traitors to their race, accused of enabling a new social order that threatened long-standing privileges. By striking at both groups, the Klan aimed to collapse Reconstruction from within. What distinguished this period was not just the scale of intimidation, but its precision. The objective was not simply to frighten individuals, but to remove leadership from entire communities. When a leader disappeared, resigned, or was forced into silence, the ripple effects were immediate. Meetings stopped, campaigns stalled, voters stayed home, power shifted without a single law being changed. In this way, the Klan demonstrated a harsh understanding of how democracy functioned and how easily it could be disrupted when participation carried unbearable risks. These actions were deeply political, even if they operated outside formal institutions. The Klan sought to control outcomes while avoiding accountability, influencing elections without running candidates and reshaping governments without holding office. Its members believed they were restoring order, but the order they envisioned depended on exclusion. Citizenship, in their view, was not a right guaranteed by law, but a privilege reserved for those deemed worthy by tradition and race. As violence escalated, so did its consequences. Entire regions fell silent under pressure, and the promise of Reconstruction began to erode. Federal authorities eventually responded, recognizing that what was unfolding was not local unrest, but organized resistance to the Constitution itself. Investigations, arrests, and military enforcement weakened the Klan's national structure, and its formal leadership faded from view. Yet by then, the central objective had largely been achieved. Black political participation had been drastically reduced, and reform-minded coalitions were fractured beyond easy repair. The decline of this first incarnation of the Klan did not mark a victory for equality, but a transition to a quieter form of control. With political dominance restored through elections shaped by fear, Southern elites no longer needed secret networks to enforce compliance. Laws, customs, and institutions took over, embedding inequality into daily life. The Klan had shown how power could be reclaimed not by overturning democracy outright, but by hollowing it out from the inside. This phase of the story reveals how leadership and organization turned prejudice into a sustained political force. Under figures like Forrest, the Klan was no longer just reacting to change. It was actively engineering outcomes. The damage done during these years would not disappear with the organization's temporary collapse, because the ideas it enforced had already reshaped the boundaries of American citizenship. When federal authorities finally moved against the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s, it appeared, at least on the surface, that the campaign of organized intimidation had been defeated. New laws were passed, troops were deployed, and investigations exposed the secrecy that had protected the group for so long. Arrests followed, trials were held, and the Klan's national structure collapsed under pressure. Newspapers declared the invisible empire finished, and for a brief moment, it seemed that the forces of democracy had reclaimed control. But history rarely ends so cleanly. While the organization weakened, the ideas that had fueled it did not disappear. Instead, they adapted. The terror that once operated at night gave way to systems embedded in daylight, quieter, but no less effective. As Reconstruction drew to a close and federal troops withdrew from the South, political power steadily returned to the very elites who had resisted reform from the beginning. They no longer needed secret oaths or disguises, because the machinery of government itself could now enforce exclusion. Voting rights, once protected by federal oversight, were slowly stripped away through legal barriers designed to appear neutral while producing predictable results. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and complex registration rules reshaped elections without openly violating the law. Participation declined, not because people had lost interest in civic life, but because the cost of engagement became too high. Democracy remained in name, yet its reach narrowed dramatically, hollowed out by procedures that favored one group while sidelining another. At the same time, segregation hardened into daily routine. Separation became policy rather than threat, shaping schools, transportation, housing, employment, and healthcare. These divisions were justified as tradition or order, but their effect was to lock inequality into place, generation after generation. The violence that had once been used to impose control did not vanish. It simply became more selective, erupting when boundaries were challenged. Its presence, even when unspoken, reinforced the message that the social hierarchy was not open for negotiation. This era was defined by contradiction. On paper, the Constitution promised equal protection. In practice, access to opportunity depended heavily on race and location. Communities adapted in different ways. Some resisted openly. Others quietly built institutions within the limits imposed upon them. Churches, schools, and mutual aid networks became centers of resilience, preserving hope in an environment designed to suppress it. Progress continued, but it moved slowly, constrained by forces that had learned to operate within the system rather than against it. What made this period especially enduring was how normalized inequality became. Without the spectacle of secret societies or dramatic confrontations, injustice blended into everyday life. Children grew up accepting separation as natural. Laws reinforced habits, and habits shaped belief. The original Klan no longer needed to exist because its worldview had been absorbed into structures that appeared stable and legitimate. Control was maintained not through constant fear, but through predictability, repetition, and the weight of custom. Decades passed under this arrangement, and while moments of challenge arose, they were often met with swift resistance. Each attempt to expand rights revealed how deeply entrenched the system had become. The legacy of the Klan's first era was not its robes or rituals, but its success in demonstrating that equality could be delayed indefinitely through a combination of law, culture, and selective force. The organization faded, yet its influence lingered, shaping the landscape in which future struggles would unfold. This chapter of the story underscores a crucial lesson. Defeating an organization is not the same as dismantling the beliefs that sustain it. The first clan was suppressed, but the conditions that allowed it to thrive were left largely intact. As a result, its ideology survived, quietly guiding policy and practice for generations, waiting for moments of change to re-emerge in new forms. As the United States entered the 20th century, the nation appeared to be moving forward at an unprecedented pace. Cities expanded upward, factories reshaped daily life, and millions of immigrants arrived with hopes of opportunity and belonging. Yet beneath this surface of progress, old anxieties persisted. Social change. Cultural diversity and shifting power dynamics unsettled many who feared that the country they recognized was slipping away. It was in this climate of uncertainty that the Ku Klux Klan found the conditions it needed to return, not as a shadowy remnant of the past, but as a modern mass movement. The spark came in 1915 with the release of a groundbreaking motion picture, The Birth of a Nation. Technically innovative and emotionally powerful, the film presented itself as a sweeping historical epic, offering audiences a dramatic retelling of the Civil War and its aftermath. For millions of viewers experiencing cinema on this scale for the first time, the images felt authoritative, almost educational. The story it told, however, was deeply distorted, portraying white-robed figures as heroic defenders of order and depicting social change as chaos. In doing so, the film did more than entertain. It reshaped memory, recasting history in a way that validated fear and resentment. The response was immediate and far-reaching. Screenings became cultural events, drawing crowds across the country. Conversations sparked by the film extended far beyond theaters, influencing how Americans understood their past and their present. For some, it offered reassurance during a time of rapid transformation, suggesting that strength, unity, and tradition could be restored through collective action. These sentiments did not go unnoticed. A new generation of organizers recognized an opportunity to revive the Klan, this time with structure, branding, and ambition suited to a modern age. Unlike its first incarnation, the revived Klan was not confined to the South. It expanded nationwide, presenting itself as a respectable fraternal organization rooted in patriotism and moral order. Carefully staged ceremonies, standardized symbols, and public parades replaced secrecy with visibility. Membership drives were organized with business efficiency, turning recruitment into a profitable enterprise. For many who joined, participation offered more than ideology. It promised social status, economic connections, and a sense of belonging in an increasingly complex world. This new Klan spoke the language of its era. It positioned itself as a defender of traditional values against what it portrayed as outside influences, appealing to those unsettled by immigration, urbanization, and cultural change. Its message broadened, extending hostility beyond race to include religion, politics, and lifestyle, allowing it to draw support from a wide cross-section of society. In doing so, it embedded itself not only in private associations but also in public life. By the early 1920s, the organization had become a formidable force. Its influence reached into city councils, state legislatures, and even national politics. Candidates sought its endorsement, and policies aligned with its worldview found legislative support. The Klan's reach extended into media and entertainment, shaping narratives through newspapers, radio programs, and public events. It presented itself as both a moral authority and a civic institution, blurring the line between social club and political power. What made this era particularly striking was how normalized the movement became. Participation no longer required secrecy or fear of exposure. Families attended gatherings, businesses advertised affiliations, and public demonstrations were held in broad daylight. The movement thrived not on isolation, but on visibility, convincing millions that it represented the mainstream rather than the margins. In this form, the Klan no longer appeared as a reactionary force clinging to the past, but as an organization claiming to define the future. Yet this resurgence carried within it the same contradictions that had marked earlier chapters. While presenting itself as a guardian of order, it relied on exclusion. While claiming moral authority, it was driven by fear of change. The rebirth of the Klan in the 1910s and 1920s demonstrated how easily old ideas could be repackaged for a new generation, amplified by modern media and fueled by uncertainty. It was a reminder that progress does not erase prejudice, but often provokes it, and that movements thought to be defeated can return when conditions allow them to speak in a new voice. As the decades passed, the Ku Klux Klan entered a long period of decline, not through a single decisive defeat, but through a series of blows that exposed its weaknesses and contradictions. Scandals involving its leaders shattered the image of moral authority it had carefully constructed. Corruption, abuse of power, and criminal behavior revealed a gap between the values the organization claimed to defend and the reality behind closed doors. Trust eroded, membership fell, and what once appeared unstoppable began to fracture from within. Economic hardship further accelerated this collapse. The Great Depression stripped many supporters of the financial stability that had made membership attractive. Dues went unpaid, chapters dissolved, and the promise of social advancement through affiliation lost its appeal. As the nation struggled to survive, movements built on fear and division could no longer command the same attention. Practical concerns replaced symbolic ones, and the Klan faded once more from the center of public life. World War II delivered another powerful blow. As Americans were mobilized to fight authoritarian ideologies abroad, the language of unity and shared purpose made open intolerance harder to justify. Soldiers from diverse backgrounds served side by side, challenging long-held assumptions about identity and belonging. The contrast between the values being defended overseas and the exclusion practiced at home became increasingly difficult to ignore. Public exposure, investigative journalism, and popular culture played a role as well, pulling back the curtain and portraying the Klan not as heroic or respectable, but as deeply un-American. Yet the documentary makes clear that decline did not mean disappearance. While organizations collapsed, the ideas that sustained them proved more resilient. Whenever the nation entered periods of rapid change, whether through demands for civil rights, nearby expanded democracy, or cultural transformation, those ideas found new ways to resurface. They adapted to new language, new symbols, and new platforms, often distancing themselves from past failures while preserving the same underlying fears. This pattern is the central warning of the story. History does not move in a straight line toward progress. Advances provoke resistance, and moments of expanded freedom often reveal how fragile those gains can be. The Klan's repeated rise and fall shows that the real struggle is not only against organizations, but against narratives that divide society into insiders and outsiders. These narratives can lie dormant for years, only to reappear when people feel threatened or uncertain about the future. Understanding this history matters because it reminds us that democracy requires more than laws and institutions. It depends on memory, awareness, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The past does not stay in the past when its lessons are ignored. By examining how these movements rose, collapsed, and returned in altered forms, we gain insight into how easily fear can be mobilized and how important vigilance remains. Thank you for watching and staying with this story until the end. If you found this documentary meaningful and believe that understanding history helps us navigate the present, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. Your support allows us to continue exploring complex stories with honesty and depth. Until next time, thank you for listening.